Welcome to Slumbertainment. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let yourself relax. Tonight's story is The Smithy. Please like and subscribe for more restful content. Now let's begin. The smith woke before light touched the hills and walked the worn path to the forge as he had done since the moon last grew full. The structure stood where it had always stood, stone base settled into earth, roof of woven branches darkened by seasons of smoke. Inside the hearth waited, its bed of ash still holding warmth from the day before. He knelt and cleared the grey powder with careful hands, exposing the embers beneath, their faint orange glow like something sleeping. He fed them dried grass, then small twigs, then larger pieces of wood, watching as the fire remembered itself and began to climb. The copper nuggets lay on the flat stone where he had placed them the evening prior. He had found them in the streambed over many walks, recognizing their red-gold colour among the other stones, their unusual weight in his palm. He had collected 7 pieces, each no larger than a plum, and had struck them with a river stone to test their softness. They dented rather than shattered, and he knew they would serve. Now he arranged them in a shallow clay bowl and set the bowl at the edge of the coals, watching as the fire grew hotter and the metal began to weep, losing its solid shape, becoming liquid light. The transformation took time. He added wood, adjusted the placement of the bowl, and waited. The heat pressed against his face and arms, and sweat gathered at his temples and ran down his neck. When the copper had pooled completely, glowing like a small sun in its clay vessel, he lifted it with green sticks and poured the molten metal into the groove he had carved into a flat stone. The stone had been shaped over days of patient grinding, its channel narrow and tapered, the length of his forearm from elbow to fingertip. The copper flowed and settled, hissing softly, and he watched it cool from white to orange to red to the colour of sunset. He waited until the metal no longer glowed, until he could hold his hand close without pulling away. Then he tapped the stone and the rough casting came free. It was crude, a simple bar with a pointed end, but it held the shape he had imagined. He returned it to the coals, letting it heat again until it softened, then brought it to the anvil stone. The hammerstone fit his hand as though it had grown there. He struck the copper once, twice, feeling the metal yield, watching it spread and thin. The sound rang out across the clearing, a bright note that scattered birds from the nearby trees. He worked the metal with steady rhythm, heating and striking, heating and striking. The copper flattened under his blows, lengthening, the edges beginning to define themselves. He turned it often, keeping the heat even, keeping the shape true. Sweat dripped from his chin and onto the stone, evaporating instantly. His shoulders burned with effort, but his hands did not falter. He had made blades before, small ones, learning the way metal moved, the way heat changed its nature, the way each strike carried intention. The point came first, shaped carefully, thinned gradually from the centre. He worked it with smaller stones, refining the taper, testing the edge with his thumb. The copper took an edge differently than stone, softer, more forgiving, but also more willing to bend. He heated the blade again and laid it flat, striking along its length to work out the unevenness, to encourage straightness. The tang emerged from his shaping, a narrow extension that would seat into a handle, and he tapered it with patient blows. By midday the blade had found its form. It was as long as his hand from wrist to fingertip, leaf-shaped, the edges curving gently to meet at the point. He brought it to the water trough and lowered it in, watching steam rise in a sudden cloud. The metal darkened, the bright copper turning to a deeper red-brown. He drew it out and examined it, turning it in the light. The surface bore the marks of his hammer, small facets that caught the sun. It was not smooth like water-worn stone, but it held a different beauty, the beauty of intentional making. He spent the afternoon grinding the edges against a sandstone slab, working with circular motions, feeling the copper yield. The metal dust gathered on the stone, a fine red powder that stuck to his damp skin. The blade grew sharper, its edges thinning, capable now of parting leather or cutting plant fibre. He tested it against a scrap of hide, and it sliced cleanly. He felt satisfaction settle in his chest, quiet and sure. The handle required wood, and he chose a piece of oak he had been drying near the hearth. He split it lengthwise and carved a channel in each half to receive the tang, working with a flint blade, removing thin curls of pale wood. When the fit was close, he bound the two halves around the tang with sinew, wrapping tightly, letting the wet sinew shrink as it dried. The handle grew solid in his grip, warm and familiar. As the sun lowered, he sat outside the forge and held the finished dagger, feeling its weight, its balance. The copper glowed softly in the evening light, and the oak handle was smooth against his palm. He had made a thing that did not exist before, had coaxed metal from stone and given it purpose. Tomorrow there would be other work, other things to shape, but today there was this. One blade, complete, resting in his hands as the first stars appeared and the forge behind him ticked and cooled in the gathering dark. Generations later, a different smith arrived at the forge, while dew still clung to the grass, and found the building unchanged, its stone walls solid, its thatch roof weathered but whole. The anvil stone had been replaced by something better, a large block of granite worn smooth on top from use, and he ran his hand across it in greeting before turning to the hearth. The pit was deeper now, lined with fired clay that held heat longer, and he built the fire with practiced efficiency, layering charcoal over kindling, watching the flames take hold and settle into steady burning. He had prepared the metals the night before, measuring them with care. 9 parts copper weighted in one clay crucible, dark red pieces he had melted and cast into ingots over previous days. In another smaller vessel sat 1 part tin, pale grey and soft, collected through trade from people who lived near distant hills. He had made bronze before, had learned the proportions from the old smith who worked here in earlier seasons, but each time still required attention, still demanded respect for the transformation that would occur when the metals married in heat. The charcoal bed glowed white at its centre, and he used a hollow reed to blow air across the coals, intensifying the heat until it shimmered above the pit. He placed the copper crucible first, watching the metal soften and collapse into itself. Becoming liquid, its surface bright and almost painful to look at directly. When the copper had fully melted, he added the tin, seeing it disappear into the larger pool, the two metals swirling together, becoming something new. The bronze glowed with a different quality than pure copper, slightly paler, and when he poured it into his mould, the colour spoke of strength. The mould itself was an improvement over the simple stone channel. He had shaped it from beeswax first, carving the exact form he wanted, then embedded the wax in fine clay mixed with ground charcoal and old crushed pottery. When the clay dried, he had heated it, letting the wax melt and run out, leaving a perfect hollow. Now the bronze filled that hollow, and he waited for it to cool before breaking away the clay shell, revealing the rough casting beneath. The blade emerged longer than the copper one would have been, meant for a different purpose, its proportions more refined. He examined the surface, checking for voids or cracks, finding none. The bronze was sound, denser than copper, harder, and he knew it would hold an edge that copper could not. He returned it to the coals, heating it until it glowed a deep red, then carried it to the anvil with iron tongs. Another improvement: metal gripping metal. His hammer was iron as well, its head fitted to a wooden handle, heavier than the river stones that had served before. The first blow rang out differently, a clearer tone, and the bronze responded with less spreading than copper, requiring more force, more precision. He worked methodically, heating and hammering, drawing out the blade, thinning the edges, establishing the central ridge that would give the weapon rigidity. The work demanded his full attention, each strike building on the last, the form emerging gradually from the rough casting like something remembered. Sweat ran freely despite the cool morning air. The heat from the forge filled the space, radiating from the hearth, rising from the metal itself. He paused to drink from a leather flask, the water warm and slightly stale, then returned to the rhythm. The blade lengthened under his hammer, its shape becoming deliberate, purposeful. He created a fuller along each face, a shallow groove that reduced weight without sacrificing strength, hammering carefully to keep the depression even, symmetrical. The tang required delicate work, forged narrower than the blade, tapered to fit the handle he would make. He shaped it with measured strikes, checking its alignment against the blade's axis, ensuring straightness. Bronze was less forgiving than copper in this regard. A mistake would require reheating and careful correction, and he had learned to work with patience, allowing the metal to guide him as much as he guided it. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the blade had achieved its preliminary form. He set it aside to cool completely, then began the long process of refining the edges. The grinding stone was new to the forge, a large wheel of sandstone that he could rotate with a foot treadle while holding the blade against its surface. Water dripped onto the stone from a vessel hung above, keeping the stone wet, washing away the bronze dust. The sound was rhythmic, soothing, a continuous whisper beneath the rasp of metal on stone. He worked one edge, then the other, alternating to keep the blade balanced, feeling for the symmetry with his hands and eyes. The bronze took on a smoother finish as he progressed, the hammer marks fading, the surface becoming almost luminous. He increased the angle of the grind near the edge, creating a sharper bevel, testing frequently with his thumb, feeling the keenness develop. The metal dust collected in the water trough below the stone, turning it a milky green. The edge required further attention with finer stones, and he moved to hand grinding, working the blade in long smooth strokes against wet stones of increasing smoothness. The bronze responded beautifully, the edge thinning to something that caught the light like a line of captured sun. He tested it against wood, against leather, finding it far superior to copper, capable of cuts that would have been impossible before. For the handle, he selected horn, a material that had become more common in recent seasons. He had 2 sections of cow horn, already split and flattened, and he shaped them to fit the tang, carving with bronze tools that themselves spoke to the metal's utility. The horn was dense and strong, pleasant to hold, and he polished it with fine sand until it gleamed. He drilled holes through horn and tang using a bow drill tipped with bronze, then pinned the assembly with bronze rivets, hammering them flush on both sides. The final step was heating the blade once more, not to red heat, but to a lower temperature, just enough to change the metal's nature slightly, to relieve the stresses created by hammering. He let it cool slowly in the dying coals, buried in ash, the heat dissipating over hours. When he finally withdrew it, the blade had taken on a golden tone, warm and rich, the surface now bearing the subtle rainbow colours that bronze develops when properly worked. He held the completed dagger as evening arrived, feeling how differently it balanced compared to copper, how the weight sat forward in the blade, how the edge promised more than the softer metal ever could. The forge darkened around him, the last light filtering through gaps in the thatch, and he placed the dagger on a wooden bench where it would rest until needed. The fire had burned down to embers, and he banked them carefully, ensuring they would survive the night, ready to wake again when he returned with the dawn. Generations later, a new smith arrived at the forge in darkness, carrying a bundle of charcoal wrapped in cloth, and pushed open the door that now hung on iron hinges. The building had gained walls of proper stone, mortared and squared, and a chimney rose from the hearth to draw the smoke upward and out. She set the charcoal beside the fire pit and began her preparations, moving through the familiar sequence of tasks that would ready the forge for the day's work. The bellows hung on the wall, leather bags stitched and fitted to wooden boards, and she tested them briefly, feeling the rush of air they produced, the way they made the banked coals brighten and glow. The iron bloom waited on the work table, a rough mass of metal and slag that she had produced over the previous 3 days. She had layered charcoal and ore in a clay furnace, tending the fire without rest, adding fuel and watching the temperature until the ore had softened and begun to weep iron. The bloom had emerged as a spongy mass, far from pure, filled with impurities that would need to be driven out through patient forging. She lifted it now, feeling its weight, perhaps as heavy as a newborn lamb, and carried it to the hearth. The fire built quickly with the bellows working, the charcoal burning hotter than wood ever could, and she buried the bloom in the heart of the coals. The iron needed to be nearly white with heat before it would move properly under the hammer, and she waited, working the bellows steadily, watching for the colour to change. When the bloom began to glow bright enough to hurt her eyes, she pulled it from the fire with long tongs and carried it to the anvil. The anvil itself was iron now, a substantial piece that had been brought to the forge by cart, traded for 3 bronze spearheads and a cauldron. It rang true when struck, a clear, sustained note, and its face was smooth and hard, ready to shape metal that would have damaged the softer bronze or stone that came before. She brought her hammer down on the bloom and felt the impact travel up her arm. Sparks flew in bright cascades, bits of slag and scale breaking away, and the bloom began to compress under the blows. She worked it systematically, heating and hammering, folding the iron when it became flat, welding it to itself with heat and force. Each folding consolidated the metal, drove out more impurities, refined the structure into something stronger. The work was heavy, demanding strength through the shoulders and back, and sweat soon soaked her tunic despite the cool air. She paused only to drink or to adjust the fire, maintaining the rhythm, feeling the iron begin to change beneath her hammer from a rough bloom into something that could be shaped with intention. By mid-morning, the iron had been worked down to a bar roughly the length of her forearm, clean of most slag, its surface showing the grain of the metal, the layers created by folding. She examined it closely, checking for cracks or seams that might indicate weakness, finding none. The iron was sound, ready to become a blade. She heated one end until it glowed white and began drawing it out, thinning it, creating the point. The iron moved differently than bronze, requiring more heat, more force, responding with a kind of stubborn integrity that demanded respect. The blade took shape slowly, emerging from the bar through countless heats and countless hammer blows. She worked the edges down, creating bevels, thinning the cross-section while maintaining the spine. The iron wanted to curve slightly as she hammered, and she corrected this constantly, flipping the blade, striking strategically, coaxing it straight. Her hands knew when the metal was at the right temperature, when it would move easily, when it needed to return to the fire. The knowledge lived in her muscles, in the way her body leaned into each strike, in the angle of the hammer as it fell. She created the tang with care, drawing it out from the blade's base, tapering it, making it long enough to pass through the handle she envisioned. The transition from blade to tang required smooth forging, a gradual change in thickness that would prevent weakness at the junction. She worked this area repeatedly, checking the profile from multiple angles, ensuring the alignment was true. The blade was nearly the length of her hand and wrist together when she finished the rough forging. She set it aside and built up the fire again, preparing for the transformation that would make the iron something more. She had learned from the old smith that iron could be hardened, that heating it until it glowed like sunset and then plunging it into water would change its nature, make it capable of holding an edge that would not fold or dull quickly. But the process was unpredictable, sometimes causing cracks, sometimes leaving the metal too brittle. She heated the blade evenly, watching the colour climb from red to orange to yellow, pulling it from the fire when it reached the shade of ripe wheat. The water trough waited, and she lowered the blade into it quickly, feeling the resistance as the metal tried to warp from the sudden cooling. Steam erupted in a violent hiss, and she held the blade steady, keeping it straight as it quenched. When the hissing stopped, she withdrew it and examined the surface. The metal had darkened, and when she tried to file it, the file skated across without biting. The hardening had worked, but hard iron was brittle iron, and she needed to temper it, to bring back some flexibility. She cleaned the blade's surface with fine sand until the metal shone, then placed it over the coals at a distance, not in direct contact with the fire. She watched as colours began to bloom on the iron, starting near the spine where it was thickest. Pale yellow appeared first, then deepened to gold, then to purple, then to blue. She pulled the blade when the edge showed pale straw and the spine showed blue, then let it cool slowly in the air. The grinding took the remainder of the day. She worked the blade against stones of increasing fineness, removing the forge scale, refining the bevels, bringing the edge to sharpness. The iron held the edge better than bronze, and she felt satisfaction in the way it cut through test materials, the way it maintained its keenness even after repeated use. For the handle she used oak, 2 pieces shaped and fitted, bound with copper wire that she had hammered flat into decorative bands. As darkness returned, she held the finished dagger and felt the weight of iron, heavier than bronze, more solid, more enduring. The blade caught the firelight with a grey gleam, functional and plain, speaking of strength rather than beauty. She wrapped it in oiled cloth and placed it with the other work she had completed, knowing it would serve well, knowing the Iron Age had taught her hands new songs, harder songs, that rang from the anvil into the evening quiet. Generations later, another smith entered the forge before dawn and lit the oil lamp that hung from a beam, its steady flame pushing back the darkness. The building had been roofed with slate now, the stones overlapping in tight rows that shed rain and kept the interior dry even in the worst weather. He moved to the hearth and began laying the fire, using kindling he had split the evening before, adding charcoal in careful layers. The bellows were larger than they had been, mounted on a pivot, and when he worked the handle they produced a strong, steady stream of air that made the coals roar to life. The steel bar lay on the workbench, purchased from a merchant who had travelled many days to reach the village. It was finger thick and as long as his forearm, already refined, cleaner than anything he could produce from ore alone. He had tested it with a file, feeling how the tool bit into the surface, judging the steel's hardness, its quality. It was good material, consistent, without the variations that often plagued iron forged from blooms. He picked it up and felt its weight, its potential, then carried it to the fire. Steel required less work to consolidate than raw iron, but it still demanded respect. He heated the bar until it glowed orange and began forging the point, drawing out one end with smooth, deliberate strikes. The hammer rang against the anvil in steady rhythm, and the steel lengthened, thinning, the tip emerging sharp and true. He worked both sides evenly, flipping the steel constantly, checking the straightness against the anvil's edge. The steel moved more uniformly than the iron he had worked with in his youth, responding with a kind of willingness that made the forging feel almost like conversation. He established the blade's profile gradually, widening it near the guard, tapering it toward the point. The shape he created was narrower than older designs, meant for piercing as much as cutting, and he forged a pronounced midrib down the center to give the blade stiffness without excess weight. The work progressed through the morning, each heat taking the steel a little further toward its final form. He paused occasionally to drink water or to rest his arm, but the rhythm of the work pulled him back, the pleasure of seeing the blade emerge from the rough bar. The fuller he created with a specialized tool, a half-round piece of steel that he had made for this purpose. He heated the blade and set the tool against it, striking the tool's back with his hammer, driving it into the steel to create a smooth depression along each face. The fuller needed to be centered precisely, and he worked with care, checking his progress, making adjustments, ensuring symmetry. When finished, the groove ran the length of the blade, lightening it, giving it an elegant appearance that spoke of refinement and purpose. The tang was forged last, drawn down from the blade's base, narrowed but kept thick enough to provide strength. He created a shoulder where blade met tang, forging it square and crisp, a place where the guard would seat. The transition pleased him, the way the forms flowed into each other yet remained distinct. He set the blade aside to cool slowly, covering it with ash to prevent too rapid a temperature change. While the blade cooled, he prepared the quenching medium. He had learned that different liquids produce different results, and for this blade he wanted a quench that would harden thoroughly without risking cracks. He filled a wooden trough with rendered tallow, animal fat that had been cleaned and melted, now cooled to a consistency like soft butter. The fat would cool the steel more slowly than water, more evenly, reducing the stress of transformation. When the blade had cooled enough to handle, he returned it to the fire and brought it up to heat slowly, watching the color develop. The steel needed to reach the critical temperature, hot enough to change its internal structure, and he judged this by color and by testing with a magnet that would no longer hold when the steel was ready. At the right moment, he withdrew the blade and plunged it smoothly into the tallow. The fat hissed and smoked, and he moved the blade gently through the medium, ensuring even cooling. When he withdrew it, the steel had darkened and hardened, and a file skated across its surface without cutting. Tempering required precision. He polished a section of the blade until it gleamed, then held it over the coals at a careful distance. Colors began to appear, oxide layers forming as the steel heated. He watched them spread and deepen, pulling the blade when the edge showed pale yellow and the spine showed blue. The colors told him the steel had been softened just enough, given back the resilience it needed to flex without breaking, while maintaining the hardness that would hold an edge. The grinding took hours. He worked at a large wheel turned by a foot treadle, the stone spinning steadily as he held the blade against it, water flowing from above to cool the metal and wash away the swarf. The blade emerged from the grinding with clean bevels, the edge thinning to a sharp apex, the fuller smooth and even. He moved to finer stones, polishing the bevels until they caught the light, removing the scratches left by coarser grits. The steel took on a soft grey luster, functional rather than decorative, but beautiful in its own way. He made the guard from a piece of flat steel, cutting it to shape with a chisel, filing a rectangular slot through its centre. The guard slid onto the tang and seated against the shoulder, fitting tightly. He had shaped a pommel from bronze, a simple round weight that would balance the blade, and drilled and threaded it to receive the tang's tip. The handle itself he carved from walnut, a single piece split lengthwise, the halves shaped to fit the tang and pinned with brass rivets. Assembly required care. He heated the tang's end and threaded the pommel on, peening the protruding metal to lock everything tight. The handle scales went on next, glued and pinned, then filed flush and polished smooth. The completed dagger balanced perfectly at the guard, the weight of pommel and blade cancelling each other, creating a tool that felt almost alive in the hand, ready to move as the wielder intended. As evening settled, he tested the edge against a piece of leather hung from a rafter, feeling how cleanly it cut, how the steel sang through the material. The blade was superior to anything that had come before, harder, sharper, more durable. He cleaned it with an oiled cloth and examined it in the lamplight, seeing how the steel gleamed with a quiet authority. The forge had produced countless blades over its long life, but this one, forged from purchased steel with techniques refined over generations, represented a kind of perfection, a balance of material and method that satisfied something deep in his chest as he wrapped the dagger and set it aside, the day's work complete, the fire burning low. Generations later, a fresh pair of hands arrived at the forge as church bells rang across the valley, their sound carrying through the morning mist. The building stood where it had always stood, but the walls were whitewashed now, the chimney rebuilt with brick, and glass filled the windows on the eastern side to let in light. She unlatched the heavy door and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar smell of coal dust and iron scale. The forge had been quiet for 2 days while she attended to other matters, and she felt the particular pleasure of returning to work, of resuming the rhythm that shaped her days. She began with the fire, using coal rather than charcoal, the black lumps that burned hotter and longer, though they produced more smoke. The coal had been delivered by wagon from mines she would never see, places where men worked underground in darkness to bring up the fuel that powered forges like hers. She arranged the coal in the hearth and lit it with paper and kindling, then worked the bellows until the coal caught and began to glow with the distinctive blue flame that spoke of proper combustion. The steel she had chosen lay on the workbench, 3 bars of different character. The first was high in carbon, hard and somewhat brittle, capable of taking an exceptional edge. The second was milder, tougher, more forgiving. The third was something in between. She planned to forge them together, creating a laminated blade that would combine the best qualities of each steel. The technique one she had learned from her father, who had learned it from his father, the knowledge passing down through generations of smiths who had worked in this same space. She heated all 3 bars together, bringing them to welding temperature, watching for the moment when the surface began to sparkle with tiny bursts of light. At that moment she withdrew them and placed them side by side on the anvil, the hard steel in the centre, the milder steels flanking it. She struck them together with heavy blows, the impact welding them into a single piece, the different steels bonding at the molecular level, becoming one while retaining their individual properties. The welding required multiple heats, each one bringing the steel back to the critical temperature, each hammer blow driving the layers more tightly together. She worked methodically, her movements efficient from years of practice, her body knowing how to position itself, how to swing the hammer for maximum effect with minimum wasted effort. The forge rang with her work, the sound echoing off the walls, travelling out through the open door to where chickens scratched in the yard and a dog lay sleeping in a patch of sun. Once the bars were fully welded, she began shaping the blade, drawing out the composite steel, forging the point, establishing the edges. The laminated construction meant she had to work carefully, keeping the heats even, preventing the layers from separating. She created the blade's profile with attention to proportion, making it longer and more slender than earlier designs, meant for a nobleman who had commissioned the piece through a merchant in the nearest town. The dimensions had been specified, written on paper in careful script, and she referred to them occasionally, checking her work against the measurements. The blade emerged slowly from the composite bar, its form elegant, its lines clean. She forged the tang and shoulder, keeping the transition crisp, then set the blade aside and turned her attention to the guard and pommel. These she fashioned from brass that she melted in a clay crucible, pouring the molten metal into carved moulds. The brass cooled to a golden colour, and she filed and polished the pieces until they gleamed, creating decorative elements that would please the buyer while serving their functional purpose. The quenching required judgment. The blade's composite structure meant different parts would harden at different rates, and she needed to account for this in her technique. She heated the blade carefully, bringing it to temperature zone by zone, then quenched it in oil, a refined product that gave consistent results. The blade hissed and steamed, and when she withdrew it, the steel had darkened, the edge now hard enough to scratch glass, the spine still tough enough to flex without breaking. She tempered the blade by cleaning it to brightness and heating it over the forge until colours appeared. The hard central layer showed straw yellow along the edge, while the softer backing steels took on deeper blues and purples. She quenched again, locking in the temper, then began the long process of finishing. The grinding wheel spun under her foot, and she worked the blade against it with steady pressure, creating the bevels, refining the edge geometry. Water sprayed from the wheel, and steel dust accumulated in the trough below. A grey sludge that spoke of material removed, of shape refined. The polishing took the remainder of the afternoon. She moved through progressively finer abrasives, working by hand now, feeling the surface smooth under her fingers. The blade developed a satin finish, soft and even, showing the subtle line where the different steels met. She etched the blade briefly in vinegar, which darkened the mild steel more than the hard steel, making the lamination visible as a delicate pattern along the edge. The effect was subtle but beautiful, a sign of quality construction that a knowledgeable buyer would appreciate. The handle she assembled from horn and brass, fitting the components together with precision, peening the tang end to lock the pommel secure. She carved the horn scales with simple decorative lines, nothing ostentatious, but enough to elevate the piece above purely utilitarian work. The brass pins she filed flush and polished, and the completed handle felt comfortable in her grip, balanced, ready. She sharpened the blade on her finest stone, working the edge until it would shave hair from her arm, then tested it against various materials, satisfied with its performance. The dagger was perhaps the finest piece she had made this season, the product of knowledge accumulated over her lifetime, techniques refined through constant practice. She wrapped it in oiled linen and placed it in the wooden box where finished work awaited collection, then banked the fire and cleaned her tools, the day ending as the light faded and the bells rang again across the valley, calling people to evening prayers. The forge settling into quiet as she closed the door and walked home through the gathering dusk. Generations later, the forge was opened by another smith an hour before sunrise, his boots crunching on gravel that had been laid along the path. The building had been expanded, an addition built onto the southern side to house the grinding and finishing equipment, keeping the dust and noise separate from the main forging area. He unlocked the door with a key that hung on a ring with others, keys to the storage shed and the coal bin and the cabinet where he kept his better tools. Inside, the forge waited in darkness, and he lit the gas lamps that hung from the ceiling, their mantles glowing white and casting steady light across the workspace. The fire he built with coke, the refined coal that burned clean and hot, producing less smoke than raw coal and fewer impurities. He shoveled it into the hearth and opened the valve on the blower, a mechanical device powered by a foot treadle that delivered a constant stream of air. The coke ignited quickly and settled into a deep red glow, the heat building, the forge coming to life. He set out his tools, arranging them on the bench in the order he would need them. The hammers of various weights, the tongs, the measuring calipers, the square. The steel bar was different from anything that would have been available a generation earlier. It had been produced in a large furnace miles away, melted and cast and rolled to exact dimensions, its carbon content carefully controlled. He had purchased it from a catalogue, selecting the grade he wanted, the size, the quantity, and it had arrived by rail wrapped in paper with an invoice listing its properties. He examined it now, checking for flaws, finding none. The steel was uniform, consistent, ready to be transformed. He heated the bar and began forging, working with efficiency born of practice. The blade he created was utilitarian in design, without the decorative elements that had characterized earlier work. The shape was straightforward, practical, meant for use rather than display. He forged the point, drew out the edges, created a simple fuller to reduce weight. The work progressed steadily, the hammer strikes measured, the heats carefully controlled. He had learned to waste neither time nor material, to work with purpose, producing pieces that would serve their function reliably. The tang he forged with a shoulder, but kept the ornamentation minimal. This was work for a merchant who would sell it onward, not a commission from someone who would treasure the piece. The blade needed to be good, needed to perform, but did not require the hours of finishing that a custom piece demanded. He worked within those parameters, finding satisfaction in the efficiency, in producing quality work at a pace that made economic sense. When the forging was complete, he moved to heat treatment, the process now guided by more precise knowledge than smiths before him had possessed. He had a thermometer, a device with a metal probe that he could insert near the blade, reading the temperature from a dial. He heated the steel to the specified range for its carbon content, watching the numbers climb, pulling the blade when the indicator reached the correct mark. The quenching oil waited in a metal tank, and he lowered the blade into it with smooth motion, the oil designed specifically for this purpose, its properties consistent batch to batch. The blade hardened evenly, and he checked it with a file to confirm the transformation. Satisfied, he moved to tempering, using a small furnace he had built for this purpose, an insulated box that maintained even temperature. He set the blade inside and monitored the thermometer, bringing the steel to the tempering range and holding it there for the prescribed time. The process was less dramatic than watching colours bloom on polished steel, but it was more reliable, producing consistent results that he could depend on. The grinding room was separate, accessed through a door, and he carried the hardened blade there to begin finishing. The grinding wheel was large, perhaps 3 feet across, mounted on a shaft turned by a foot-powered mechanism. Later smiths would have motors for this, but for now the work still required his legs to pump the treadle, keeping the wheel spinning at speed. He wore goggles made of wire mesh to protect his eyes from sparks, a precaution that had become standard practice, and he worked the blade against the wheel with steady pressure. The bevels emerged clean and even, the wheel cutting efficiently, removing material quickly. He worked both sides, maintaining symmetry, checking frequently with calipers to ensure consistent thickness. The edge geometry he created was specific, the angle chosen based on intended use. The principles of cutting now understood more thoroughly than they had been before. He ground until the edge approached its final thickness, then switched to finer wheels for polishing. The blade took on a grey satin finish, smooth and even, free of scratches deep enough to see. He buffed it lightly with fine compound on a cloth wheel, bringing up a slight sheen without going to high polish. The finish was practical, resistant to showing wear, appropriate for a working knife. He etched his mark into the blade near the guard, a simple stamp of his initials that identified the work as his, then neutralized the acid and cleaned the steel thoroughly. The handle components he had prepared earlier, pieces of hardwood shaped on a lathe, drilled to receive the tang. The guard was steel, simple in the form, and the pommel was a plain cylinder threaded to match the tang. He assembled the knife with attention to fit, ensuring no gaps, no looseness, peening the tang end to lock everything secure. The handle he finished with linseed oil, applied and buffed, bringing out the grain of the wood while protecting it from moisture. The sharpening he performed on a series of stones, working through grits, establishing the final edge. The blade responded well, the steel taking sharpness easily, holding it when he tested against paper and leather. He made minor adjustments, refining the edge until it satisfied his standard, then cleaned the blade and handle, removing any fingerprints or oil. The finished dagger he placed in a simple leather sheath he had made. Nothing fancy, just serviceable protection for the blade. He wrapped the piece in paper and tied it with string, wrote the merchant's name on the outside, and set it with the other completed work awaiting delivery. Through the window he could see the sun rising higher, the morning progressing, and he felt the satisfaction of work completed competently, efficiently, meeting the demands of the day. He cleaned his workspace and banked the fire, preparing for the next piece, the forge settling into its rhythm, steady and productive, serving its purpose as it had for longer than anyone could remember, adapting to new materials and methods while remaining fundamentally unchanged, a place where metal was shaped by heat and force, where skill expressed itself through the objects it produced. Generations later, yet another smith arrived at the forge before full light and flipped the switch beside the door, electric bulbs overhead flooding the space with bright illumination. The building had been wired years ago, the cables running through conduit mounted to the ceiling, the power drawn from lines that stretched across the countryside, connecting towns and farms to distant generators. She walked to the workbench and set down her thermos of coffee, then moved to the forge itself, a gas-fired unit that replaced the coal hearth. She turned the valve and pressed the ignition switch, hearing the click and whoosh as the burner caught, blue flame licking across the ceramic interior. The steel she had selected lay waiting, a bar of high-carbon alloy purchased from a specialty supplier who catered to knife makers and tool makers. The specifications had been precise, the carbon content listed to 2 decimal places, the alloying elements specified by percentage. She had chosen this particular steel for its ability to harden deeply, to take a keen edge, to resist wear. The metallurgy was understood now in ways that earlier smiths could never have imagined. The crystal structures and phase transformations documented in textbooks, the heat treatment procedures calculated and published. She heated the bar in the gas forge, watching through the opening as the steel came up to temperature. A pyrometer mounted to the forge displayed the internal temperature, a thermocouple reading transmitted to a digital display. She waited until the numbers climbed into the proper range, then pulled the bar and carried it to the power hammer. The machine sat in the corner, a mechanical device driven by an electric motor, its ram capable of delivering rapid controlled blows. She positioned the steel under the hammer and activated it with a foot pedal, feeling the machine respond, the hammer striking dozens of times per minute. The steel moved quickly under the power hammer, flattening and spreading, and she manipulated it with tongs, turning it, repositioning it, drawing out the blade's rough form. The work that would have taken an hour with a hand hammer took minutes with the machine, and she appreciated the efficiency even as she missed something of the direct connection between hand and metal. She finished the rough forging and returned the blade to the gas forge, bringing it back to heat for further shaping. The profile she created by hand, working at a traditional anvil with a hand hammer, refining the curves, establishing the blade's character. This was where the machine work ended and the craft began, where decisions about proportion and line required human judgment. She forged the point carefully, thinning it, making it acute. The fuller she created with a spring fuller, a tool that attached to the anvil's hardy hole and shaped the groove through pressure rather than impact. She worked both sides, keeping the fuller centered, creating a clean depression that lightened the blade without compromising strength. The tang emerged from deliberate forging, tapered and refined, and she created the transition with attention to smooth flow. She brought the blade through progressively finer shaping until it approached its final dimensions, then set it aside to normalize. The normalizing process involved heating the steel to just above its critical temperature and allowing it to cool in still air, relieving internal stresses, refining the grain structure. She performed this 3 times, each cycle bringing the steel closer to optimal condition for hardening. The heat treatment she approached with care, following a procedure she had developed through testing and research. She had access to information earlier smiths could only dream of. Metallurgical data published in journals and books. Time temperature curves that predicted exactly what would happen to the steel's structure under specific conditions. She heated the blade in the gas forge, monitoring the pyrometer, pulling it when the temperature reached the austenitizing range for this particular alloy. The quenching oil waited in a temperature-controlled tank, held at precisely 90 degrees, and she lowered the blade into it with smooth vertical motion. The blade hardened to a state of extreme hardness, brittle but capable of taking an exceptional edge. She tempered it in an electric oven, a small kiln she had acquired specifically for this purpose, setting the temperature controller to the exact degree she wanted. The blade remained in the oven for 2 hours, the heat softening the martensite just enough to restore toughness without sacrificing too much hardness. When she withdrew it and let it cool, the steel had achieved the balance she sought. She tested the hardness with a Rockwell tester, a mechanical device that measured the material's resistance to indentation. The reading confirmed her heat treatment had succeeded, the numbers falling within the target range. Satisfied, she moved to the grinding equipment, a belt grinder powered by an electric motor, the abrasive belt running at high speed. She wore safety glasses and a dust mask, modern protections that prevented injury and illness, and she worked the blade against the belt with practiced control. The bevels emerged quickly, the belt removing material efficiently, and she worked through progressively finer grits, moving from coarse to medium to fine. The blade took on a smooth finish, the scratch pattern from each belt erasing the marks left by the previous one. She finished with a leather strop loaded with polishing compound, bringing the bevels to a soft luster that showed the steel's quality. The edge she sharpened on a guided system, a device that held the blade at a consistent angle, while she worked stones along its length. The system ensured symmetry, producing an edge that was even on both sides, properly formed. She moved through the stones methodically, feeling the burr develop and then disappear as the apex refined. The final stone left an edge capable of shaving hair, cutting paper cleanly, performing at a level that represented the current understanding of edge geometry and sharpening technique. The handle she crafted from stabilized wood, a material that had been impregnated with resin to make it more durable and resistant to moisture. She shaped the scales on a belt sander, working them down to fit the tang, drilling holes for the pins on a drill press. The guard and pommel were stainless steel, machined components she had purchased from a supplier, fitted precisely. She assembled the knife with epoxy adhesive, a modern glue stronger than any mechanical fastening, and pinned everything with brass rod cut and peened flush. The completed dagger balanced in her hand with the precision of careful design, each element contributing to the whole. She had used modern materials and equipment, had benefited from accumulated knowledge, but the essential work remained unchanged. Metal had been heated and shaped, an edge had been formed, a tool had been created. She packaged the knife in a fitted box and placed it with the other work she would ship to customers who had ordered through her website. The forge now connected to the wider world through cables and signals, its products travelling to places she would never see. The ancient craft continuing in new forms as the day ended and she turned off the lights and locked the door. Generations later, the forge welcomed a new smith as dawnlight touched the windows and pressed the touchscreen panel mounted beside the door, bringing the building systems online. The ventilation fans hummed to life, drawing fresh air through filtered vents, and the LED lighting illuminated gradually, simulating natural sunrise. The forge had been renovated again, the walls insulated and finished with clean white panels, the floor covered in sealed concrete that could be swept and mopped easily. Everything was organised, labelled, efficient, the workspace designed for both productivity and safety. He moved to the computer workstation in the corner and logged in, pulling up the design file he had created the previous week. The dagger existed first as a three-dimensional model on the screen, every dimension specified, every curve calculated. He had drawn it using specialized software, adjusting proportions, testing different blade profiles virtually before committing to physical work. The design represented days of refinement, small changes made and evaluated, the final form emerging through iteration rather than intuition alone. The steel bar waited in the material rack, a piece of powder metallurgy steel that had been manufactured through a process unknown to earlier smiths. The metal had been created by atomizing molten steel into fine powder, then compacting and sintering it under enormous pressure and heat. The result was steel of exceptional uniformity, with carbides distributed evenly throughout, without the banding or segregation that could occur in conventionally produced material. He had selected this particular alloy for its combination of toughness and edge retention, properties documented in data sheets provided by the manufacturer. He set the bar in the gas forge, a computerized unit that maintained precise temperature through feedback control. A thermocouple sensed the internal heat and adjusted the gas flow automatically, holding the steel at the exact temperature he had programmed. He watched the display as the numbers climbed and stabilized, then retrieved the bar and carried it to the hydraulic press. The machine replaced the power hammer of earlier decades, applying controlled pressure rather than impact, forming the steel with gradual force. He shaped the blade profile on the press, working through stages, each one bringing the metal closer to the final form. The process was quieter than hammering, the hydraulic ram extending smoothly, squeezing the steel between shaped dies. he had made the dies himself, machining them from tool steel on the milling machine that occupied another corner of the workshop. The precision of the dies meant the forging emerged clean and accurate, requiring less grinding later. Between heatings, he checked dimensions with digital calipers, reading measurements to thousandths of an inch, comparing them to the specifications in his design file. The work progressed methodically, each step documented, each parameter controlled. He appreciated the precision even while recognizing that something had been lost, some quality of variation and adaptation that earlier smiths had embraced. He found his satisfaction in accuracy instead, in achieving exactly what he had planned. The tang he forged carefully, using hand tools now, working at the anvil because some operations still required direct control. The feedback of hammer on steel, the ability to make immediate adjustments. He shaped the transition from blade to tang, refining it, ensuring the shoulder sat square. The steel cooled between heats on a ceramic fibre blanket, insulation that held warmth without damaging the work surface. The heat treatment followed a protocol he had developed through systematic testing. He had hardened dozens of test coupons, varying the temperature and quench medium, then tested the results for hardness and toughness. The data had led him to a specific procedure: austenitize at 1975 degrees for 15 minutes, quench in preheated oil at 130 degrees, then temper twice at 400 degrees for 2 hours each cycle. He followed this procedure exactly, using the computerized forge for heating, the temperature-controlled oil tank for quenching, and the electric oven for tempering. The resulting hardness he verified with a digital hardness tester, a device that measured resistance through multiple methods, displaying the reading on a screen. The numbers confirmed successful heat treatment, the steel now at 61 on the Rockwell C scale, hard enough for excellent edge retention, tough enough to resist chipping. He recorded the data in a spreadsheet, maintaining records of every blade, tracking his processes, looking for patterns and opportunities to improve. The grinding he performed on a variable speed belt grinder, adjusting the belt speed for different operations, using ceramic belts that cut aggressively and lasted far longer than older materials. He wore a respirator fitted with proper filters, protecting his lungs from the ultrafine particles that the grinding generated. The ventilation system captured most of the dust, pulling it through filters before exhausting the air outside. He worked the bevels with attention to symmetry, checking frequently with calipers, measuring the thickness at multiple points along the blade. The finish he created with a series of abrasive steps, moving to finer grits, then polishing with compound on a buffing wheel. The blade developed a satin finish, smooth and even, professional. He etched it briefly in ferric chloride, an acid that darkened the steel slightly, providing contrast, then cleaned it thoroughly with acetone and isopropyl alcohol, removing all residue. The handle construction involved modern materials chosen for their properties. He used G10, a fiberglass laminate that was impervious to moisture, dimensionally stable, available in various colors. He cut the scales on a bandsaw, shaped them on the belt grinder, drilled them on the drill press using carbide bits. The pins were stainless steel, and he used epoxy rated for high-strength bonding, mixing it in precise proportions using a scale that read to hundredths of a gram. Assembly required care, ensuring proper alignment, avoiding gaps. He clamped the handle scales while the epoxy cured, using a jig he had designed to maintain even pressure. When the adhesive had set, he shaped the handle on the grinder, blending the scales to the tang, rounding the edges for comfort. The finished handle he polished with fine abrasive, bringing it to a smooth, tactile finish. The sharpening he performed on a guided system mounted with precision stones, Japanese waterstones that cut quickly and left fine edges. He worked through the grits, establishing the apex, refining it, testing the sharpness with paper cuts. The final edge would shave hair, slice paper cleanly with minimal pressure, performing at a level achievable only with modern understanding and equipment. He photographed the completed dagger with a digital camera, placing it against a neutral background, lighting it carefully to show the blade's finish and the handle's form. The images would go on his website, in his portfolio, documentation of work completed. He packaged the knife in a custom foam-lined case, included a care card printed on his laser printer, and prepared it for shipping to the customer who had ordered it months before through email, the transaction conducted entirely through electronic means. Money transferred digitally, the physical object travelling through networks of transportation while its maker remained here, in the forge that had stood for longer than memory, adapting again to new times while maintaining its essential purpose. Generations later, another keeper of the forge arrived. The smith walked to the forge in the pre-dawn quiet and unlocked the door with a fingerprint scanner that blinked green at her touch. Inside, the building responded to her presence, lights rising to her preferred brightness, climate control adjusting, the environmental systems calibrating themselves to occupancy. She set her bag on the workbench and pulled out a tablet, scrolling through messages from clients, requests for custom work, inquiries about lead times. The forge had become something both ancient and modern, a place where metal was still shaped by heat, but where every other aspect had been touched by advancing technology. She opened the design software on the large monitor mounted above the workbench, pulling up the file for today's project. The dagger had been modelled in 3 dimensions, but more than that, it had been analysed. The software had calculated stress distribution, predicted how forces would travel through the blade during use, identified potential weak points. She had run simulations, testing the design virtually before committing steel and time to its creation. The final form represented not just aesthetic choice, but engineering optimization, a balance of factors that earlier smiths could only approximate through experience and sometimes failure. The steel she had chosen was an advanced powder metallurgy alloy, a material that pushed the boundaries of what steel could be. The manufacturer had combined elements in proportions that would have been impossible with conventional melting, creating a matrix studded with microscopic carbides of precise composition. The data sheet promised exceptional edge retention, high toughness, and resistance to corrosion, properties approaching what seemed like conflicting goals, made possible through material science that continued to evolve. The bar sat in its packaging, labelled with batch numbers and certification documents, traceability extending back to the powder production facility. She heated the steel in an electric forge, a unit that maintained temperature through precise control systems, displaying real-time readings on a digital interface. The heating was even, controlled. The atmosphere inside the chamber carefully managed to prevent oxidation. When the steel reached forging temperature, she removed it with tongs and carried it to the press, a newer model than the hydraulic units of earlier years. This one servo-controlled, capable of adjusting force and speed in real time based on sensor feedback. The forging progressed through careful stages, each one monitored, the press applying exactly the force required, no more, no less. She watched the metal flow, seeing how it responded, making adjustments through the machine's interface. The blade took shape with remarkable accuracy, emerging from the process close to final dimensions. She worked the transition areas by hand, using a power hammer for detail work, but the bulk of the material removal had been accomplished with mechanical precision. Between operations, she measured with a laser scanner, a device that captured the blade's three-dimensional form and compared it to the design model, displaying deviations in color-coded maps on her tablet. The feedback allowed her to make corrections, to refine areas that had drifted from specification. The process felt different from the purely manual work of earlier times, less about developing an eye for proportion through years of practice and more about executing a predetermined plan with accuracy. The heat treatment followed a protocol she had developed through extensive testing, but testing aided by technology. She had access to a dilatometer, an instrument that measured dimensional changes in steel as it was heated and cooled, allowing her to determine transformation temperatures with precision. She had mapped the kinetics of this particular alloy, knew exactly when austenite formed, when martensite began to appear during quenching. The knowledge removed much guesswork, replacing it with certainty. She austenitized the blade in a vacuum furnace, a sealed chamber pumped down to near vacuum, eliminating oxygen that might cause scaling. The steel heated evenly, thoroughly, and when it reached the target temperature, she transferred it quickly to the quench tank. The oil was synthetic, engineered for consistent performance, and the tank maintained its temperature through active cooling systems. The blade emerged hardened, its surface clean and bright, free of the scale that had characterized earlier work. Tempering occurred in a precision oven, programmable to complex cycles, capable of holding temperature within a few degrees across the entire chamber. She tempered twice, following best practice, allowing the blade to cool completely between cycles. The resulting hardness she verified with a digital tester, but she also prepared a cross-section, mounting a small sample in resin, polishing it to a mirror finish, then etching it to reveal the microstructure. Under a metallurgical microscope connected to her computer, she examined the steel's internal architecture, seeing the tempered martensite, the carbide distribution, confirming at a microscopic level that the heat treatment had succeeded. The grinding she performed on a computer-controlled belt grinder, a machine capable of maintaining precise angles, equipped with sensors that detected pressure and adjusted belt speed accordingly. She still guided the blade, still made decisions, but the machine compensated for minor variations in her hand pressure, ensuring consistent results. The bevels emerged symmetrical to a degree that would have been difficult to achieve manually, the geometry exact. She finished the blade with ceramic belts that left an exceptionally fine scratch pattern, then moved to polishing with diamond compound on leather, the abrasive suspended in a carrier, the particles measured in microns. The blade took on a refined satin finish, the surface smooth at a microscopic level, reducing friction, improving cutting performance. She tested the finish with a surface roughness meter, a device that measured the peaks and valleys, confirming the quality met her standards. The handle materials were synthetic, engineered polymers that offered properties unavailable in natural materials. She used carbon fiber scales, lightweight and incredibly strong, resistant to impact and environmental degradation. The material had been formed in layers, resin-impregnated fabric cured under heat and pressure, then machined to final dimensions. She shaped the scales with carbide cutters, the material being too hard for conventional tools, working on a small milling machine that followed programmed paths. Assembly used aerospace-grade adhesive, a two-part epoxy that cured at room temperature but could be accelerated with heat. She applied it precisely, using a dispenser that metered exact amounts, ensuring no voids, no excess. The pins were titanium, lightweight and corrosion-proof, and she peened them with an ultrasonic tool that vibrated at high frequency, forming the heads without impact, without disturbing the surrounding material. The sharpening she approached with modern understanding of edge geometry, using a system that held the blade at calculated angles, working through abrasive films graded in precise progressions. The films were polymer-backed, coated with micron-sized particles of aluminum oxide and diamond, each grade removing the scratches from the previous. The edge emerged acute and polished, capable of performance that earlier smiths would have found remarkable. She tested the blade with a laser system that measured cutting force, drawing the edge through standardized media while sensors recorded the data. The numbers confirmed what her experience suggested, that the blade performed exceptionally, efficiently converting applied force to cutting action. She documented everything, saving files, adding notes, building a knowledge base that would inform future work. The completed dagger she photographed with a high-resolution camera, the images captured in controlled lighting, showing every detail. The photos would be processed, color-corrected, uploaded to her website and social media, shared with the thousands who followed her work online. She packaged the blade in a case she had designed and printed on a 3-dimensional printer, custom-fitted, lined with foam cut by laser. The tracking number generated automatically when she printed the shipping label, the package entering a logistics network that would deliver it across continents within days, the forge connected to everywhere, its work travelling far while the building remained, adapting still, continuing its purpose as afternoon light slanted through windows, and she began preparing for the next project, the cycle unbroken. Generations later, a new hand took up the forge. The smith came to the forge as light broke over the hills and paused outside the door, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of the morning settle around him. The building stood as it had always stood, its stones solid beneath layers of repair and renovation, its purpose unchanged despite centuries of transformation. He placed his hand on the door, feeling the wood grain beneath his palm, then entered and moved through the space with the ease of long familiarity. He did not activate all the systems, did not turn on every light or machine. Instead, he opened the windows to let in the morning air, lit a simple gas forge that sat in the corner, the kind that required nothing more than a valve and a match. The flame caught and settled into quiet burning, and he watched it for a moment, seeing in it the echo of all the fires that had burned here before, the unbroken chain of heat and intention stretching back beyond memory. The steel he had chosen lay on the bench, a bar of good quality carbon steel, not exotic, not engineered to extremes, but honest material that would serve its purpose well. He had ordered it without consulting databases or comparing specifications, had simply selected it because he knew this steel, had worked it before, understood its nature. The bar was cool in his hands, patient, waiting. He heated it slowly, watching the colour change, and when it reached the right temperature, he carried it to the anvil and began to forge. The hammer was one he had made himself years ago, its head shaped from tool steel, its handle fitted and refitted until it felt like an extension of his arm. The anvil was old, perhaps older than the current building, its face bearing the marks of countless blows, the ring of it familiar and true. He worked without haste, each strike deliberate, the metal responding under his hands. The blade emerged gradually, its form simple, its lines clean. He forged no elaborate fuller, no complex geometry, only the essential shape, the fundamental profile that a dagger required. The point he drew out carefully, the edges he thinned with attention, and the tang he shaped to receive a handle that would be comfortable and secure. The work felt meditative, the rhythm of it settling into his body, the heat and sound and effort combining into something that occupied him completely. He thought of nothing but the steel, the temperature, the next blow, the way the metal moved, the way it resisted and yielded. the conversation between hammer and anvil that had continued here for longer than anyone could say. This was work stripped to its essentials, craft without the overlay of technology, making for the sake of making. When the forging was complete, he set the blade aside to normalize, heating it again and letting it cool in still air, the old method, reliable and sufficient. He performed this 3 times, not because sensors told him to, but because experience had taught him this was right. The blade relaxed as it cooled, the stresses finding equilibrium, the steel preparing itself for what would come next. The heat treatment he approached with care, but not anxiety. He heated the blade until it glowed the color of sunset, tested it with a magnet that fell away when the steel was ready, then quenched it in oil that he had used for years, its properties familiar. The blade hissed and steamed, and he held it steady, feeling it harden, feeling the transformation occur. When he withdrew it, the steel had changed, had become something harder, more permanent. He tempered it in a simple oven, watching through the door as colours bloomed on the clean surface, pulling the blade when the edge showed straw and the spine showed blue. The colours were beautiful in their way, the physics of light and oxide layers creating something that looked like art but was simply truth, the steel showing him what had happened within it. He let it cool naturally. No forced air, no rush. The grinding he did by hand, working the blade against a bench stone, feeling the steel yield under his pressure. He moved through progressively finer stones, creating the bevels through patient repetition, checking the symmetry by eye and touch, making adjustments when needed. The work took hours, but he did not count them, did not measure his efficiency, simply continued until the blade was right. The edge he refined with careful attention, working through whetstones he had accumulated over years, some inherited, some purchased, each one familiar under his hands. He knew these stones, knew how they cut, how much pressure to apply, when to add water, when to clean the surface. The blade grew sharper with each pass, the edge thinning, converging, becoming capable. For the handle he chose wood, a piece of walnut he had been drying for months, its colour deep and warm. He split it and shaped it with hand tools, using a chisel and a rasp, working slowly, removing thin shavings, feeling the form emerge. The wood fitted to the tang, and he pinned it with brass rod, filing the pins flush, sanding the handle smooth. The wood took on a soft glow as he worked it, the grain becoming visible, the natural beauty of the material revealed through simple finishing. He sharpened the blade one final time, stropping it on leather loaded with compound, the finest abrasive he would use, and tested the edge against paper, against wood, finding it performed as he had hoped. The dagger was complete, a simple thing, unadorned, functional, honest. It was not revolutionary, did not push boundaries or demonstrate new techniques. It was simply well made, the product of skill applied with attention, knowledge earned through practice. He held the dagger as evening approached, the light through the windows growing golden, and felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with innovation or progress. This was the satisfaction of work done well, of material respected and shaped with care, of a tradition maintained not through preservation but through continuation. The forge had made daggers for centuries, would perhaps make them for centuries more, each one a small act of creation, each one proof that some things remained valuable not because they were new, but because they were true. He wrapped the blade in cloth and placed it on the shelf where finished work rested, then cleaned his tools and swept the floor, putting the space in order. The fire burned low, and he let it, watching as the flames diminished, as the forge settled into quiet. Outside, the first stars appeared, and he stood in the doorway looking out at the hills, at the path he had walked that morning, at the world that had changed in countless ways, while this building, this purpose, this act of making had endured. He closed the door gently and walked home through the gathering darkness, knowing he would return tomorrow, that the forge would wake again, that metal would be heated and shaped, that the work would continue as it always had, patient and persistent, a quiet defiance against the assertion that everything must change, a reminder that some things need only be done well, again and again, the repetition itself a kind of perfection, the cycle unending, the smithy standing ready, waiting for the next dawn, the next fire, the next blade.